And isn't stem cell research one of the most promising areas of medical research right now? Maybe you could just give a very quick summary of like what sort of things do we hope to be able to achieve with stem cell research that it's become such a contentious issue?
Well, in fact, this is great timing because I said there's two big developments that have happened in the last couple of weeks. So the other one speaks to this point. The first stem cell clinical trial using cells derived from a human embryonic stem cell have gotten the green light from the FDA. A hold that had been preventing that from going forward has now been released. And so the very first clinical trials are imminently underway using cells derived from what's called a Y cell line. It was an embryonic stem cell line developed at Wisconsin. And this is for research for acute spinal cord injury. And what they're hoping to do is to be able to take, in the first 2 weeks after an acute spinal cord injury that's going to result in paralysis, and be able to essentially remyelinate, essentially use neurostem cells to regenerate the damaged area right after the acute phase of the injury, and therefore, hopefully, they're hoping to allow people who would otherwise be paralyzed to be able to walk.
So the idea is that they'll be able to take these stem cells, which have not become specialized yet, and cause them to specialize to become whatever kind of cell they want.
Right, and in particular, they've been able to create a very particular set of cell types that are almost impossible to isolate in any kind of significant number. And doing this, they've been able to create enough of these cell types to be able to actually go forward with these transplants.
Are stem cells only found in embryos, or do adults also have a few stem cells that haven't become differentiated yet that you could possibly extract?
Well, there are a lot of different kinds of stem cells. So there are stem cells that are of a particular type that can turn into different types of blood cells or different types of muscle cells. What's unusual about embryonic stem cells is they're what's called pluripotent. They have the potential to turn into any cell type. And previously it had been thought that only embryonic stem cells really had that capacity. A really big development, and it's important to note that that development was partly able to take place as a result of knowledge gleaned from human embryonic stem cell research. But what happened was they were able to actually understand more about the genetic basis of pluripotency, which is something that they're still exploring and understanding more and more all the time, to create something called induced pluripotent stem cell research. That's where they take adult cells that have already been differentiated into particular kinds of cells, and by genetically altering just a few genes, literally as few as 3 or 4 genes, they're able to actually revert it back to an undifferentiated state where it can turn into many of the different cell types.
Let's talk a little bit about organ transplantation, because this is another area that has a lot of ethical implications, and organ transplants are becoming more feasible technically, but the demand is greater than the supply. So how should we decide who gets the organs?
So that's a really great question, and it's been a really tough issue. If you actually go to unos.org or the optn.org, you can actually see on a minute-to-minute basis how many people are currently on the wait list. I think right now it's about 106 or 108,000 people who are on the wait list in the U.S.
In the U.S., okay.
And it's growing every week. You see that number going up and up and up. There's under 30,000 transplants that are done a year in the U.S., and so you can see the math that the number goes up every year. 8,000 people plus die while on the wait list every year. So the need is very, very acute. So that makes it really important that the system be fair, and while it's not perfect, there are parts of the system that I think work actually pretty well and are pretty fair. The fairest part of the system are the rules that we have for how we distribute organs once you're on the list. So what you do typically is, if you're somebody who's having a failure of an organ, say you're having kidney failure or liver failure, you go to a transplant center to talk to physicians who will assess you and see how sick you are, see whether your condition is curable or reversible, or whether you're likely to need a transplant. They do an assessment of whether or not the transplant's likely to succeed and help you. And if you get on the list, then where you fall on that list is entirely determined by objective criteria. So it's a function for livers, for example, by a combination of biological match, how sick you are, and your geographical area. So organs are first distributed within a geographical area.
Is it only medical reasons? For example, would they say, well, this person has been very productive all their life, and this person has been less productive, so it would be better, you know?
Not at all. So your place on the wait list is completely determined by geography, biological match, essentially antigen matching, and how sick you are. There's something for livers called a MELD score. That's a way of capturing how sick you are, and when a given organ pops up in the particular area, like so we're in the Bay Area, in a fairly large area. If a liver becomes available in our area, the local organ procurement organization called the California Transplant Donor Network would basically look at the list and see whoever has the highest MELD score, whoever the sickest person is, who's a biological match for that liver in the Bay Area. For kidneys, instead of how sick you are, it's done by wait time. So whoever has been on the wait list longest gets the organ.
So your probability of making a complete recovery to full health would not necessarily be a decisive factor?
That's only a factor in deciding whether you're going to get on the list. Now, there are some inequalities in the system. One of them is that there's a lot of variation from geographical region, to geographical region. Regions for the purposes of transplant are not like congressional districts. Congressional districts are all roughly the same size of population. That's not true. So here in California, we have 4 OPO areas, one for the Bay Area, one for the San Diego area, one for the Los Angeles area, and one for the Sacramento area, which is a really tiny, tiny little area. As a result of that, and because of the different makeups of their population, Sacramento has to wait only about half as long a time for getting a cadaveric kidney as people in the Bay Area. And in fact, we have one of the longest wait times here in the Bay Area for livers in the country.
Now, I gather that you're not allowed to sell your organs.
That's
if
correct.
people were allowed to sell them, that might increase the supply.
That's true, possibly. The challenge is that it may persuade others not to get into the system at all, and a lot depends on what kind of market you would have. If you have what's called a buyer's market, where you allowed individuals to pay for these organs, you would likely have tremendous inequalities. And in fact, the few countries that have allowed a buyer's market in organs have wound up having a huge amount of problems with that, in which there's coercion, poor people essentially become fodder for the rich, and you have huge inequalities in the system, which in turn drives out the altruistic donors who might be likely to serve as donors. So you don't necessarily get more organs, you just wind up distributing them more unfairly. However, there's another option, which is sometimes called a seller's market, where you had some kind of controlled process where people would be paid a certain set amount, for example, by the government in exchange for being a donor, as a way of incentivizing people, but without creating some of the sort of uglier aspects of allowing a market in organs. But the real challenge there is that the justification for any market is likely to lead to a slippery slope from a seller's market to a buyer's market. So I think this is a huge challenge, and most of the medical community and most of the ethics community have really looked at this issue, have been opposed to any kind of sales in organs. But it is an issue being actively discussed. There was a study that was recently published in Annals of Internal Medicine, and I wrote co-wrote one of the responses to this piece, trying to do empirical studies of whether or not it might in fact work out to ethically to have a market in organs.